This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm thinking about great encounters we've had recently. England versus Germany, Koonsberg plus Cummings, which you can see on BBC iPlayer. Hello, Laura.
Hello, and here on BBC Sounds.
Yes, there's a special podcast version of it as well, multiple episodes. I mean, what was it like sitting down with this kind of now infamous person?
Well, on the one hand, I was never really sure until he actually turned up that he was actually going to turn up.
He's that kind of guy.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's somebody who doesn't hide from controversy, but he's also someone who, you know, he's never given a TV interview before. And he, first of all, because I only got to know him a little bit during the Vote Leave campaign, and it was after the European referendum, I said, would you do an interview to talk about how you think you won and how you ran the campaign, and let's, you know, talk about how you used the 350 million and did you mislead people and this, that and the other, and by the way, why do you want to blow up Whitehall? And he sort of said to me, yes, I promise you I'll do it one day. Little did I know that, you know, 5 years later when he'd finally sit down to do an interview, everything else that would have happened between that moment. So it was pretty strange from that point of view. But yeah, I mean, it was fascinating because whatever you think of him, and let's face it, for a lot of people, he's a kind of bogeyman and pantomime villain. But he's somebody who was in the room during lots of really important, vital moments for the country, whether you're thinking about Brexit or whether you're thinking about the pandemic. So it was pretty extraordinary. And
there is something about the way he carries himself and the way he tells a story or explains a point that is just very compelling as a sort of character, as a performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he has these scripts that he's written for himself. You know, he's written tens of thousands of words. You know, he's always writing these very long blogs or doing things on his Substack, isn't it? It's an internet newsletter. It's like he has these sort of scripts that he's written for himself about Boris Johnson or about what happened in the pandemic. But when you then can get him off those scripts, and one moment that sticks in my mind, you know, I asked him, you know, how would he describe himself? And he was kind of really stumped. He didn't sort of have an answer. And this, well, how do you think other people see you? And he kind of thought about it for a few seconds and then said, generally a nightmare. And when it comes to politics, you can see he's got these arguments that he has sort of justified what he's done in the last few years. And he has this sort of set of priorities. And I did this for this reason and that for that reason and this for that reason and that for that reason. But actually, in some other ways, he's not quite sure what he thinks. And also was very open-minded, curiously. And I think this is something that will really rile many people who love to hate him. He told me that while he thinks Brexit has been a good thing, he said, you have to have a screw loose if you're sure about questions like that.
I think anyone who says they're sure about questions like that has got a screw loose.
So in other words, you know, you can be happy about something in the short term, but you can't be sure what it's going to mean in the long term. And there isn't a parallel universe to actually be sure of anything, which was, you know, remarkably kind of honest in a way. But I'm sure a lot of people think, what, Dominic Cummings? He says he's not even sure if it was a good idea after everything that the country went through. What? But yeah, it was pretty interesting. And then one particular revelation that just I was very surprised by, that actually days after the general election, he told me that he and a few other people from his Vote Leave tribe had discussed whether or not they would end up getting rid of Boris Johnson by the summer, which was quite the thing.
Before even mid-January, we were having meetings in Number 10 saying, it's clear that Carrie wants rid of all of us. At that point, we were already saying that by the summer, either we'll all have gone from here or we'll be in the process of trying to get rid of him and get someone else in as Prime Minister.
We've talked about the fact that people have very strong views about him. I mean, can we believe everything that he says? Or actually, does that not even matter? It's the act of saying them and him believing them that matters.
I think that you can't dismiss testimony from somebody who genuinely was a first-hand witness to lots of important conversations and moments. Should you, however, as a sentient being and smart listener, which of course all our newscast listeners are, have in your head that someone's saying something from a particular viewpoint, someone's saying something after a real bitter, acrimonious split. Yes, of course. But it was interesting what some of the initial kind of feedback to this has been. So I had a text message from an MP, and of course this is just one MP, but I think it's quite interesting. Let me just find it to explain to our lovely newscasters, because I just thought this was interesting. They said, Cummings is a hurt ex-employee, but telling 80% of the truth, I suspect. I'm afraid we are seeing early repetitive signs of an increasingly isolated and out-of-touch Prime Minister, about to lose even more experience in number 10, which will make things worse. Now, the timing of this interview is coincidental, right? You know, Downing Street have had a very choppy 10 days or so, haven't they? And the timings of this interview, this has been, fixed for a while. It's a kind of a matter of, diaries and things that were going to work and not, and when lockdown finished and all those kinds of things. But by chance, it has arrived at a moment when, as that MP suggested, there are, a fair few people in the Tory party going, this all looks a bit rocky.
Yeah, because you had the levelling up speech last week, which wasn't as big as Build or as intellectual or as specific as people might have liked.
Right.
Then you had Pinggate over the weekend,
Right.
which, right or wrong of what the initial position was or where they ended up with,
messy.
it's anytime
Messy,
you turning
messy.
on a big thing like that is messy. Yeah, and then this reminding everyone about the arguments there were behind the scenes.
Well, right,
back in October.
and the whole thing about, has Boris Johnson fundamentally taken the risk from COVID seriously enough? And the WhatsApp messages that Dominic Cummings revealed, which are the bit that, Downing Street does not deny the content of those, show that in that moment back in the autumn, and Boris Johnson was, looking for reasons not to do another national lockdown. Now, it's important to say, of course, those decisions are very, very difficult. Having a lockdown, lots of people would argue, is the best way of actually dealing with coronavirus. Of course, a lockdown comes with other very serious costs on the other side, whether that's about the economy, people's businesses, or other kinds of health needs losing out. But it plays into this, what's quite a widespread perception amongst some Tories who worry about Boris Johnson, or his opposition critics who like to claim that he's reckless. And it plays into that. And it also just, it's, I think quite a lot of people will watch, if they watch the whole or listen to the whole hour, which of course I recommend. Some of it just also seems quite grubby, He says, well, I used him and he used me and we exploited each other. And that kind of transactional political thing is just, I think a lot of people will just kind of recoil from that and think, wow, is that how Boris Johnson really kind of does business?
And maybe in 35 years' time, it will be a play on Broadway.
Maybe, but it's already an hour-long interview on iPlayer and BBC Sounds.
Yes, if you missed it on what our bosses call linear television, it's available on lots of things that you can click instead. But then you are regular podcast listeners, so you know all about that already.
You do.
Right, go and lie in a darkened room, Laura.
Thank you. See you later. Bye everybody.
Yeah, when you hear those clips and some of the things he said about Boris Johnson, you just think, wow, there is surely going to be some fallout from this. But let's see what fallout there is from other stuff on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
It will take some time before we figure out what our new normal is.
Now, if that is the argument, then we are going into unprecedented territory.
Combined with contact testing, tracing.
Yes.
I'm a vegan, so of course I don't like meatballs.
Next slide, please. Blair. Lose.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
With James. How are you, Adam?
I'm very well, thank you. I suddenly realised as I was walking out of the studio yesterday, there have been some changes around here. The BBC's gone through its own step 4.
You're allowed to have more people in the lift.
You can have 3 people in the lift. So for me, that is one of the symbols of how things have changed.
As a dedicated stair person who has walked up 5 flights of stairs to get here, because I was down quite a lot in the basement, haven't noticed things at all. Nothing's changed for me.
Okay. Well, also, have you noticed we've got a new kitchen?
Well,
I don't think it's COVID related.
They're slowly percolating on different floors. So down where I am on level 2, now we've still got the old one, but the taps don't work. Nightmare.
See, the world's moving on. We're talking about kitchens rather than COVID.
And I'm left behind.
So, I mean, do you have any thoughts about now that we've had, this is our second day of the great unlocking or whatever people want to call it?
I suppose my big thought remains that we've rolled the dice and we're still waiting to see whether the gamble of unlocking pays off. Because while there are a great many people that say everything will be fine, and there are a great many people that say we're heading towards disaster, the truth is that we really actually don't know. The mathematical models forecast both of those scenarios, and it could be somewhere in between. And there's so much uncertainty that really tiny things like subtle shifts in the estimate of vaccine effectiveness you use when predicting what's going to happen, or quite how we behave, is all going to affect what happens over the next weeks and months. I would feel like a fool if I was to predict what would happen.
Well, there was a great quote in the Times today from an epidemiologist saying, if we behave like things are going to be bad, things will be fine. And if we behave like things are going to be totally fine, there's a chance that they'll be bad.
I know it's so counterintuitive, but it's perfectly logical as well, because the more restrained we are, the harder it will be for the virus to take off, the lower the peak will be. But actually, if we think everything's going to be cool, we just crack on with life as normal, you and me after the end of the pod, we go clubbing, Adam, then that's when all hell might break loose.
You missed all the clubbing jokes yesterday. But also, we're still seeing this tension between there being kind of government diktat and personal responsibility. And it played out today with the NHS app, in that you got Paul Scully, a business minister, sort of suggesting that if you get pinged by the app, it's a bit voluntary whether you isolate or not. And legally speaking, specifically, that is true, because as we discussed before, there isn't a legal requirement for you to isolate if you get pinged by the app. But then there was a very strongly worded statement from Downing Street an hour or so later saying, if you get pinged by the app, you should isolate. So it's that difference between what the law is, what the message is, and then what people will choose to do.
Yeah, and this has come up a few times, hasn't it? The difference between what is legally required of somebody to do and how to behave, and also what's just in the guidance as it's termed, which is kind of like what we want you to do, but legally we have no powers to make you do it. It's worth remembering that if you are contacted by NHS test and trace, whether that's by text, phone call, or carrier pigeon, then you are still legally required to isolate. It's slightly different rules for the app.
Yes. Now, there's one group that we've heard from a few people wondering what they should do, and should they even maybe start shielding again? And it is women at various stages of pregnancy. So we thought we'd have a chat about this and find out actually what the proper advice is. And we've got Dr. Jo Mountfield, who's a consultant obstetrician and is vice president of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Hello, Jo.
Hi there.
So, what is the advice for pregnant women and getting the vaccine, first of all?
So we would recommend that all pregnant women consider getting the vaccine. And we've had obviously evolving data around this over the last several months. And it was a couple of months ago since the JCVI recommended that the vaccine was safe. The Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are the vaccines that are suitable for pregnant women, and that they were recommended for use in these group of women.
Because there was a time, wasn't there, when actually that wasn't the advice, and it was a bit of a grey area.
Yes, absolutely. And the reason for that was that we didn't have the safety data. So unfortunately, pregnant women are never high on the priority list when it comes to research. And there are obvious reasons why you don't start doing research straight away on pregnant women, because of the concerns that you've got two people involved, not just one. But they weren't involved in the research around the vaccines. And so there was more concern about the potential effects of the vaccine. And so we had to wait for the real world data to start coming through before we could have the reassurance about the safety, which we have now got much more reassuring data. So lots of women in the United States have been vaccinated, over 130,000 women. And last week, we just heard the data from Scotland. 4,000 Scottish pregnant women have been vaccinated as well. And there have been no major safety concerns. So really now we are changing our advice to consider it to, of course, it's a personal decision, but really think very carefully about whether you should have the vaccine, because it will protect you against getting COVID, and getting COVID in pregnancy, it can be potentially a serious problem.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second, but has all that advice filtered through to pregnant women? I mean, what percentage of them have had the jab?
So our latest data suggests that actually, although we've been messaging and encouraging women to discuss that with their health professionals, that actually at the moment a significant number of women are not being vaccinated. So the latest data we had suggested that 58% of them had been vaccinated, but the rest were declining vaccination. And that's a significant number of women potentially putting themselves and their baby at risk. But clearly, wanting to take a very balanced view for them as an individual as to whether they wanted to have the vaccine or not. So we're trying to help the messaging. We're trying to encourage women to go and look at the safety data and to revisit this, especially in light of the opening up this week. And so some of the other things that were protecting women as they were protecting the rest of the population have now been taken away.
Well, I was going to say, I made that point right at the start, that you hear the odd story of a pregnant woman saying, actually, I'm going to go back into something a bit like shielding now that everything's opening up again. What would you say about that?
Well, I think it's a really challenging situation for many women. If you haven't had vaccination, then that does put you at increased risk. We know that the Delta variant, which is the prevalent variant in the UK at the moment, is very highly transmissible. So it is difficult if you're in contact with groups of people who have got COVID to protect yourself completely against catching it. Clearly, we would advise still actually maintaining social distance, washing hands carefully, and thinking really carefully about going to busy places with lots of people, especially in indoor scenarios, because we know that that's the highest risk of you catching it. We're not advocating that all pregnant women completely isolate themselves from society, because that has implications for them as well. But ongoing real thought and care about where you're going and who you're mixing with would seem really sensible still, especially if you've not been vaccinated.
Jo, how big are the risks if you are a pregnant person and you catch COVID?
So there are slightly, it varies at what stage of pregnancy you're at. So our most concerning time is in the later stages of pregnancy after 28 weeks. Still, the vast majority of women who are young and are fit, who get COVID, will actually have a mild illness. And I think that's quite important to reiterate, that still for the majority, they'll have a mild illness, they'll recover from it, and they will be fine, and their baby will be fine. But we do know that the risks go up as you get further on in pregnancy, especially, as I say, after the 28-week mark, and that if you are admitted to hospital with COVID, 1 in 10 of the women who are admitted with COVID will be then subsequently admitted to the intensive care unit. And then the other risks for the baby are around premature birth. Why is that? Well, if a mum gets COVID later on in pregnancy, clearly it very much affects their breathing. Your lungs are already constrained by the fact that you've got a baby in there. And so your lungs don't work in the same way as they normally do, because they can't expand, for example, in the same way, because a baby's sitting there stopping that happening. And so that we know that we have to get mum to give birth to the baby so that we can actually then relieve the pressure on their lungs to allow them to get better. And then finally, there is also a very small increased risk of stillbirth later on in pregnancy as well with COVID. So that's not huge numbers of women. I don't want to cause major distress, but it is, we are seeing a small increase in the numbers of stillbirth associated with significant illness as well. So all those things are a real worry to us, and a reason why we really want to encourage women to think really positively about getting vaccinated to help protect themselves from these, really significant complications. And
Jo, COVID isn't the only vaccine that pregnant women are, recommended to get. There's the whooping cough vaccine, there's the annual flu vaccine. Pregnant women are all targeted for those vaccines as well.
Yeah.
How do the numbers compare? I mean, are more or fewer women taking up the COVID vaccine in comparison to the other ones? Is COVID more worrying than those other infections? I mean, how does it compare to the other things we try to vaccinate women for?
So I think flu is slightly better than that, but it's still not everybody takes up the offer of their flu vaccination. And I think it's for very similar reasons for the COVID, although COVID even more so because it's a newer vaccine, whereas we've got a lot more data around the flu vaccine. But we do know that we don't have 100% coverage or anything like it for any of these vaccination programs that we are trying to promote. And some of that is around, as I say, understandable vaccine hesitancy, but it's our job as professionals to give women as much information as we can around the safety of these vaccines, the fact that they are all dead vaccines, they're not live vaccines, they cannot give you the actual disease, and that they do not cross the placenta and cause problems for the baby. And that's what the mechanisms by which they work, should not mean that this is a real safety concern for women. And we would really want them to think carefully about going and accessing these opportunities, because it's really important to protect them and the babies.
You must know that you're up against a huge amount of false information that's out there that people will see, shared on their social media or in conversations with friends at a time that they are most vulnerable to it because they're trying to protect their unborn child. When you're trying to encourage people and reassure them, how is it that you can make sure you cut through all of that? Because just saying it saved lives doesn't always work, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think you do have to have an individual conversation with women. And I've had every day this week, I've been talking to women about the pros and cons of this and asking them about what their specific concerns are, what they've heard from social media, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. And also there can be misinformation from family members as well, which is really not helpful. So every healthcare professional, I think, has a real duty now looking after pregnant women to ask them the question whether they've had a COVID vaccination, and then engage in a constructive conversation about what are their concerns, whether you can help allay those concerns, and really focus it on what the issues are for that individual woman, listen to those issues and try and help address those and reassure them about what their concerns are, in the hope that then they can filter out some of the other messages from those other less well-informed, shall we say, sources of information, which, social media can be a marvellous thing, but it can really be very destructive at times as well.
Well, good luck with it all. Thank you very much, Dr. Jo.
Pleasure. Nice to speak to you.
Okay, we've got some breaking news on Newscast. It's very hot nearly everywhere.
The Met Office has issued its first amber extreme heat warning for parts of the UK amid sweltering temperatures, and more expected over the coming days.
Beautiful. Absolutely love it. Makes a nice change from a dodgy May and June.
Yesterday we must have gone way over 40 degrees in the shop.
I love the sunshine, don't get me wrong, but I'm not a heat person.
I get in the paddling pool. That works well.
I know that, in a few weeks' time, the cold weather and the rain will be back, and I should be moaning about that.
Well, when I'm feeling hot, the person I want to speak to is the weatherman with the mostest, Owain Wyn Evans. Hello.
Adam, I love that intro. I'm going to have that put on my kind of email footnote, just that everybody knows that's my new title.
Good. Well, if you are in an office sending emails, which no one wants to do at this point. Now, I looked up at the weather map a little minute ago on the BBC News channel, and basically it was just all red and orange.
Yeah.
So that's my layperson's view. Give me the professional view.
Well, you know what? That's a pretty good view of it, actually, Adam. It's been hot, it's been warm, and it seems like we've been in this kind of long-lasting spell of hot weather now, of course. And you may have heard that we've got some weather warnings in place because of the heat. And lots of people think that these amber heat warnings that are affecting some parts of Wales, the Midlands, the southwest of England, as well as some southern parts of England, and there's a separate one for Northern Ireland. Some people think that these are kind of brand new and that they've just been introduced right now, But actually, the Met Office introduced the warnings for heat earlier in the summer. This is just the first time we've kind of see them.
Right.
They're impact-based like the other ones that we get, for rain or for snow or whatever it may be. And they're there to warn us about the kind of impact that it could have on our health and our infrastructure. So that's the kind of warning side of things. To go back to what you said about the map being all red and orange, yeah, absolutely. We've seen those temperatures rise across the past couple of days. For me, it's a weird time, Adam, because as a weather forecaster, as a weather presenter, we no longer kind of celebrate heat in a way that we once did. There was a time when I would say, darlings, get the barbecue out, it's going to be scorchio. But we tend not to do that sort of thing anymore, just because extreme weather events are going to be more likely. And that's the result of a warming planet, that's understood. But what's happening at the moment is because we've had an area of high pressure, an extension of the Azores High, which, as the name suggests, is an area of high pressure, which is kind of around the Azores. That's helped draw warmer air up. The high pressure has led to the blue sky, the sunshine that we've seen. And, that's one of the reasons why we've just seen those temperatures rise by day and also by night.
I love all the theories that the amateur weather forecasters have, like, it's that heat wave in California or that weird heat wave they had in Canada that village burnt down. Are we linked to even further away places?
It's interesting. Sometimes we do have weather events that you see kind of happening on the other side of the Atlantic and then they kind of get to us, But more often than not, weather events are sort of separate, especially when they're happening in different parts of the world. I think that in very recent memory, of course, only this week, we were looking at the severe weather that's affected parts of Europe, parts of Germany, for example, who have seen, torrential rainfall and floods. Now, that area of low pressure actually did come near us, and then it moved down there, and it was kind of amplified by a contrast in temperatures, if you like, and the jet stream had its role to play in how that low kind of deepened. But, this area of high pressure that we're seeing is here now. It's on the way out, though. So if it's not for you, there is a change on the horizon, Adam, absolutely.
In how many days, do you reckon?
Well, at the moment, it's looking like as we head through towards kind of Friday and Saturday, there's an area of low pressure that's going to move in from the southwest. It's not going to bring us, a dramatic change in temperatures. It's not going to be cold by any stretch of the imagination, but it's certainly going to be less hot. And with the low pressure coming in, of course, that will also signal a change into something less settled. So that's on the horizon. I think it'll probably get to us through Friday into Saturday, but that's in weather forecasting terms is still a long way off.
Also, I have to confess, I've still not followed Seb Coe's advice and gone and bought a sweatband yet. Because I was asking him, how do I go for a run when it was hot last time? And he said, get a sweatband. And I was like, you are such an 80s athlete, aren't you, Seb Coe?
I love it.
Anyway, I'm going to let you go because we're recording this episode just before 6 o'clock, and that's prime time for weather presenters because it's the local news.
Yeah, that's true. I'm getting ready to do that now. So, yes, thank you very much. And thanks for having me on. Lovely to chat to you.
You too. Break a leg. Bye.
See you soon. Bye.
Well, James, as medical correspondent, you've been looking at the medical implications of this hot weather.
Well, heat waves kill people. I mean, that's the brutal and honest truth of it. And, our human bodies like to be a set temperature. They like to be 37.5 degrees. That's like our ideal core body temperature. And when it gets really hot, then we have to start trying to lose heat. Otherwise, we'll get too hot. And the way our bodies do that is it opens up loads of blood vessels near the surface of our body. But that causes blood pressure to drop. We sweat a lot, and that leads to not only dehydration, but changes in the composition of our blood as well. And all of that is relatively fine for healthy people. The problem is if you're already frail or you have other medical conditions, say you already have heart failure, then that can be the thing that tips you over, leads to a stroke, leads to a heart attack or something like that. And that is how the heat kills.
And I was reading the article you wrote about this on the BBC News website and about how the actual point of the heat wave, the point we're at, it makes a difference to how it affects people.
Yeah, and I think part of this is because it can come by surprise. So when you have a heat wave, the deaths tend to be at the beginning of the heat wave. And if you have a heat wave in late spring or early summer, it tends to be more deadly than if you have a heat wave in late August. And I think this comes down to the same reason that what happens when we go on holiday. We go on holiday a lot of the time to hot places and we're fine and we enjoy ourselves. But it comes down to that difference between what the weather is like and what we are trying to do. And so if you're still trying to do your 10K run with your Seb Coe sweatband on in the blazing heat at 1 p.m, well, you wouldn't do that if you were on holiday somewhere incredibly hot and tropical, would you? And you wouldn't try and continue to live life completely normally. You would adjust, you would take things more easily in the heat. And I think it's that thing of that contrast between how we live our lives and the heat that kind of makes it worse.
And as Owain was saying, we're just becoming aware of more of this stuff. For example, the built environment and where you live. Like, for example, I noticed you made the point, if you live in a top floor flat, you're subject to hotter temperatures than if you live in a detached house or a ground floor flat.
Yeah, and again, it comes down, green space is another massive thing. So if you can get out into a garden where you've got a tree with some shade and maybe a little bit of breeze comes through, then that is completely different to if you live in a flat in the middle of a city. The other thing you get with flats is that the modern ones tend to be built on just one side of a block of apartments. So the idea that you would open the windows on both sides of your house so you get that draft coming through just isn't possible for some people. So you're completely right. The buildings that we have in this country haven't really been designed with heat waves in mind. In the future, they're going to need to be.
And when you chat to the scientists, do they have surefire cool down tips?
So there's, if I can split it into two, there's kind of like just your general day-to-day stuff, and then there's what happens when you think there's a medical emergency in relation to the heat. So if it's almost so obvious it's stupid, stay hydrated. Like you'll see my bottle of water that I carry around with me. That is a really good idea. But there are also things that if you're getting too hot, an ice pack to your armpits or the back of the neck is highly effective. So you can do things like that as well. It's worth reflecting whether it's hotter outside your house or inside your house. So kind of like opening the windows can actually let the heat in if actually the inside of your house is cooler than it is outside. So you need to think quite carefully about the combination of do you open the windows or do you keep them shut? Closing the blinds and stuff is also very effective at keeping the heat on the outside. But you might come across somebody who has either heat exhaustion or heat stroke. And the problem if you reach the level of heat stroke is that's when they might be in incredibly high temperatures and their body stops sweating. They're basically gone too far through the other side of coping with the heat, and that becomes a medical emergency. So that's when you need to dial 999.
Okay. I found last summer one of the best tricks was the frozen bottle of water put in front of a fan.
Nice.
Now, but then you think, is this just having a psychological effect of making me feel like my environment is less hot? Or is it actually cooling me down? And I was never sure.
The fan alone will make a difference. Anyway,
yeah,
just because that will help your body to sweat, it helps with the evaporation from your skin. So that will make a difference. Another bad one for a health correspondent is eating copious amounts of ice cream, but I never told you to do that.
Does ice cream have a cooling effect?
Well, it does have a little one.
Well, on that note, I'm heading out for an ice cream. Although, as I said, we are recording this at tea time, so can I have an ice cream before I have my dinner? Apparently not. Well, that's it for this edition of Newscast. I will let you know on the next one if I decided to have an ice cream before my main course or after. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Adam.
Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.
Well, thank you for making it to the end of another newscast. You clearly ooze stamina. Can I gently encourage you to subscribe to us on BBC Sounds, and then, without having to do anything else, our meandering chat will miraculously make its way to your phone.